Welcome back, viewers. This is Frederick Noronha, and you're on Literary Goa, the program that looks at books and authors relating to Goa. Today we are looking at this book called The Great Goa Land Grab, and it's two out of three co-authors who are currently around. It's an interesting book, and we thought we'd devote some time to discussing it so that we can understand the different facets of this issue. With me today is Kenneth Nielsen, an associate professor from Oslo in Norway, and Solano da Silva, an assistant professor at BITS Pilani, Goa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, we don't have with us Heather Plumridge Bedi, who is also a co-author of this book, and she's not around, so she's based elsewhere. It's a very interesting book. It's a significant book, although I'm involved with it myself. And maybe we start, Kenneth, by asking you to give us an overview of this book. See, because this issue of land and land grab and land transfers is a huge issue in Goa. It's like, you put your hands anywhere and you see different aspects of it. Like, it's like the elephant of Hindustan, which means different things to different people. What does it mean to you all?
Yeah, thank you, Frederick. We called this book The Great Goa Land Grab in the singular. And maybe that's a little bit pretentious because we don't tell the full story of this Goa land grab. As you said, there are many things going on, many things happening. So what we do is we try to offer insights into what we think is a bigger phenomenon. And there are basically two kinds of processes we try to look at in this book that both have to do with land. One part of the process is where typically a state government will use its power of eminent domain. That is the power it has as the ultimate owner of all land to take land away from people through the use of law. And that has often been the now scrapped land acquisition law of 1894. So that's one part of the land grabbing process we try to look at.
It was a colonial law from the times of the British.
From the times of the British, from 1894, and then taken over by the post-colonial state also, and then scrapped in 2013. But in effect for more than a century. The other side of this process of land grabbing, we might probably more accurately call changing land use or changing control of land, because that has to do not so much with grabbing through force or grabbing through law, but through more quiet processes of commodification. That is turning land into a property that can be bought and sold in the market.
But it's all very legal. Let's be clear about that. It's not illegal in that sense. As the state argues, these things are legal. It may be immoral, it may be unfair, but it's legal.
But that is the $1 million question.
Okay.
And one of the things we try to describe is also how use of the law and exchange of land on the market, which is supposed to be free exchange, is often underpinned by other forces so that can be less than legal, to put it mildly, put it like this.
Interesting. So what's the contribution of each of you guys to this book? It's a collection of your writing over the last 15 years. Both of you all have focused on this hot potato. It's a complex issue. It's a tough subject. It's not only difficult to understand, but it's politically inconvenient to talk about also, because you're stepping on all influential toes. So what's the contribution of both of you all, and also Heather, who's not here?
I think we've known each other for the past 10 years or so.
How did you all meet?
Well, actually, I intruded into Solano's life. Maybe he's forgotten how it happened. No, we can start with me. I mean, I have been working in India as a researcher now for 20 years.
Mostly West Bengal.
Mostly West Bengal for many years. Then I thought at some point I need to get a change from West Bengal. I had been working there for more than a decade and a half, also looking into land conflicts and very similar things that we discuss for Goa. Then I thought, what place to go in India where we find similar contestations over land? And then I knew from my old work in Bengal that special economic zones, that we also write about in the book in a full section, had been a hugely controversial topic in Goa. So I thought, maybe Goa would be something interesting to look at. And then I started looking around to see who had worked on these issues, and there were two names that I discovered immediately. One was Solano, and the other was the second co-author, Heather Beatty, who had both written on the special economic zones. Okay. So as I was planning to go here, I started to sort of force my way into other people's lives, and Solano was one of the victims of of my many emails to people here. So, but I mean, Solano has a much longer history of looking at these things in Goa.
From College Solano, you were mentioning at the launch the other day about the role of professors in shaping this agenda, which is important, but it's invisible at the same time.
Right. Thanks, Frederick. The two things that stand out with my engagement with this are a series of lectures with Professor Peter Ronald D'Souza, who was a guru to many of us, and who often would tell us that in order to understand the politics in Goa, we ought to look at the political economy of land, as he would say. This was a kind of theoretical and hypothetical landscape that he drew for us. My direct involvement began when the regional plan around 2006 emerged, and like many other Goans, I saw the first-hand implications of that plan when the hills in Pilland started going up in flames.
In your village, that's your village.
Just literally been cut down. A lake of us, the Saule Lake, designated as a settlement area, hills being burnt for days on end.
Deliberately or by mistake or what?
We believe it was deliberate because we raised questions in the village panchayat, and many of us who asked these questions were threatened. But along with many other Goans, that began my direct engagement with questions of land, because we could see the implications in the villages we lived in.
One point that I think Kenneth made in one of his earlier talks or in the book or somewhere is that land grabs are not only happening in places like Goa. It happens across the country, across the world, across third world countries. Of course, in Goa, we feel it much more because it's probably a small place and we know it very well, and you can see the visible changes happening. But also the contestations have been much higher in Goa. Am I right in my understanding?
That's a difficult thing to answer, but my hunch would be that you are probably correct, maybe with some slight modification. When I began my work on land grabbing in India, I went to West Bengal, and there was a reason for this. And this was the time of the Nandigram and Shingur movements. And it was right
Shingur
after.
was where the Tata Nano came up.
That was where the Tata Nano factory was coming up.
Okay.
And this was also shortly after controversies in Niyamgiri in Orissa.
Which is bauxite.
Bauxite. That's a huge mining conflict. Okay. And all of these instances were met with massive police repression. There were killings and shootings, brutal violence unleashed on protesters. That being said, I would probably think that looking back at Goa's history of land struggles, I assume your assessment will be fairly on the mark, in the sense that there is this documented history of many different people's movements and people's struggles that have been focused on land, but also on the environment more broadly, not limited to land, but also having to do with pollution of rivers, for example, and industrial emissions and so on. A long history of various struggles, which has to do, on the one hand, with Goa being a very small state where these things are often felt intimately. They intrude into people's close domains and close lives. And also, as we also write about in the introduction, that there are very many economic sectors who have an interest in land in Goa. It's not limited to, for example, industries, which was the case in Bengal, or mining, which was the case in Orissa. There are many actors, many forms of capital, if you want, that have an interest in land here, which I think intensifies both the pressure but also the popular anxiety about what is happening to this state.
What's interesting about this book is it gives us a vast overview of the scale of the problem and how it fits into how different parts of the jigsaw fit in, if you want to put it that way. We always see this one-off protest and these one-off projects. Like as a journalist, I've seen, say for example, Enron, and in Ratnagiri and those areas. And you think this is one of, like, these are people protesting against one mega project, but then there is a pattern that emerges. To make that pattern clear, maybe one of you could just tell us what the book contains, because we can't assume that people are aware of that already.
Briefly, it has 3 main sections. The first section looks at legal frameworks, laws, planning that Solano also mentioned, all this state activity, you might call it, that has to do with documents, with legally regulating land, what it can be used for and who can own it and for what purposes. These are often the kind of hidden maneuvers that it can be difficult to understand and difficult to see. Then there's a section on infrastructure, which looks at, for example, the new airport up in Mopa and its long, protracted history of coming into being through many conflicts. Also a section on coal and coal infrastructures, and then a final large section on special economic zones.
And what is the contribution of each of you all and Heather to this?
Okay. I've looked largely at issues to do with the regional plans, to do with zoning, and how zoning has been used often in very insidious ways, which have transformed the value of land. And often this has been done on the one, and there are 2 sort of processes that seem to emerge over here. One seems to, where the state does zoning in order to protect green spaces, to promote agriculture, but on the other hand also devises a set of loopholes to find ways in which one can override plans that are made by other departments, etc. Heather has largely worked on SEZs and written a lot on that. Kenneth has focused on infrastructure projects, but our work has also cut across these lines. There are chapters that we have collaborated on, and we've tried to put our minds together to work on sometimes a singular subtopic within the land grab.
Very interesting, Solano, because these are technical subjects. They are hugely difficult to cope with, and we can easily forget what happened in the past. So I think you would see it as an attempt to document these case studies that have come up.
I like the idea that you mentioned that are there any patterns emerging, because otherwise we will be lost in a series of case studies, and every village has a story to tell regarding land. We see this the moment we open the newspapers every day. One of the things we foreground in this book is to get a sense of the economic transformations that Goa is undergoing. As Kenneth said, there are multiple capital interests in Goa. We have mining in the hinterland, in the midlands we have industries, etc. Now other forms are also taking place in the hinterland. And along the coast we have real estate, we have tourism. So there seems to be this patterning and an intensification. New forms, these take on new forms, seem to have emerged. And these economic pressures contest with other land uses, under existing land uses, namely agriculture and forest. And we try briefly to sketch that landscape within which we can locate what is happening in each village. What are these new policies emerging? What are they responding to? That is one kind of broader landscape that we are sketching in this book.
Just to understand the details, tell us the Pilland story, which is the story of the village where you are based.
Okay. In 2006, after the regional plan was formulated, we have a couple of sites in Pilland where we almost overnight we saw activities happening. The classic one was near the Saule Lake, where we realized the hill was completely about 1,50,000 square meters. Trees were cut. The hill was completely razed to ashes. We have grown up in these areas. We have walked on these hills. We have collected cashews on them. Other people's, entirely our lives are so closely linked with these landscapes, immediate landscapes. We could not understand what really was happening until it so emerged, and that this was happening in every other village, practically every other, especially the coastal villages. And then groups of us began to read maps. For the first time, we began to realize that there is some zoning plan. This zoning plan was changed practically overnight. It was done so brazenly that even a lake was was designated as a settlement area. And on the other side, we had also repression in the villages when some of us started to raise questions about this.
At the
we were at the receiving end.
Panchayat level.
Yeah, at the panchayat level. A lot of these, to fight these battles, a lot of us, both as individuals and subsequently as collectives, had to take on these battles because there was no other way out. Practically every Goan remembers the agitation against the regional plan. Subsequent to that, in the village itself, we saw various other, besides the regional plan, we had problems with the comunidad, for instance. In one case, we had a huge tract of land where a comunidad, we realized in the newspaper that the comunidad had, after 25 years of having a problem with two supposed tenants of the comunidad, suddenly entered into some kind of arbitration with them. Only when we dug up the details, we realized there's a huge real estate party at the background who was driving all of this. We had to go to the High Court. We won the case in the High Court. And then, but subsequently, the comunidad made plots as a way out rather than having one big construction. We had another case in Marra, next to the industrial estate, where literally an entire hill slope was sold out, most of it to people from outside Goa, from huge, extremely expensive housing. They'd done it so brazenly that they had created third-party rights before the land itself was changed in zone. That was the brazenness with which things were done. All of these battles were fought by ordinary citizens, as is the case all over Goa.
It's hard to track the paper trail because unless you know what's happening on the paper, and these with the right to information and things like that, it becomes a little bit easier, but you need a lot of persistence, you need a lot of determination.
Yes.
And which villages do you see as having worked it out particularly well? Any model examples from Goa?
I don't want to particularly zoom in on any particular villages, but all I can say is there are numerous examples. There are both individuals and groups across Goa who are doing phenomenal work in safeguarding their own villages and being very creative about imagining alternative ways, about alternative imaginations for their own villages. This is happening across Goa. You look from the north to the south, from Terracol right down to Kankon, and you move into the hinterland, you have another story there emerging of mining. You move slightly inland from the coast, you have issues to do with industrial estates and the setting up of IT parks, etc. And the dispossession of many agriculturalists. I mean, this is a story that is cutting across villages in Goa, that it is too stark a story for us to sit back and ignore. Some of us need to sit down and see, as you rightly said, what are the patterns, otherwise we're going to get lost in all of these individual stories.
Professor Kenneth, how does Goa compare to your experiences in other Indian states which you've studied?
It's a difficult question to answer briefly, I would say. I mean,
take your time.
Two things in particular, probably. One thing that I think I already touched upon is the multitude of interests in land in Goa. I mean, Solano mentioned some of these now. Mining interests in the hinterland, real estate interests increasingly everywhere, I think, more or less. Of course, infrastructural capital that's interested in harbor expansions, airport building, road widening, new railways. All these interests coming together in such a small area, I think that probably sets Goa apart And you have these multiple forms of capital, sometimes aligning, sometimes even competing with each other, because any plot of land can potentially be used for many different purposes, but only for one purpose at a time, and that creates these difficulties. I think the other key difference that I notice, especially if I look back at West Bengal, which is the state I know best, but also many other states where we've had these violent conflicts over land. I think, as Solano said now, the incredible work that is done here at the grassroots level, extremely sophisticated, with extremely informed and engaged people who can navigate paperwork, intricate regulations, who are capable of mapping and understanding and building solid cases from the bottom up. I think that is, if not unique, then I think a distinguishing feature of the kind of land struggles we see in Goa, which is capable of also fighting many legal battles and taking these things to court. If I think about my West Bengal experience, I think the most common way of contesting land grabbing, of course people would go to court, because why not? You may win. But that would never be the main strategy or sort of the main thing people would do. It would be mobilizing people in the thousands to show that you have a large mass of people aggrieved by a certain plot of land being taken away, or them being dispossessed of their land and livelihoods, building a moral kind of pressure on governments or contractors to go back and to cancel their plans, to undo the land grabbing. That would often lead to much violence, much confrontation, but the strategy was mobilizing crowds to demonstrate a grave injustice. And what the law said was, in a sense, secondary. As you said, state governments can claim this is legal. I mean, this law exists. We have power of eminent domain. We can do as we want. That was a way of sort of bracketing out questions of law and foregrounding questions of morality and injustice. I think what we see in Goa might be a much more, if not sophisticated, then at least complex way of thinking about these land struggles, where multiple strategies operate at a time in tandem, I think. So these would be some of the main differences. But at the same time, I think we try to make the case that we shouldn't see Goa as somehow unique or as a case that is only of relevance to Goa. I mean, we think that, or we hope at least, that what we try to write about in the book also becomes relevant for other parts of India, for sure, but maybe also other parts of the global south, which face, if not all the same challenges at once, then at least some of the same pressures on land with their resultant forms of social injustice.
Two questions which people who don't share your view or come from 180 degrees opposite would put across. The first question is, who is selling the land? Okay, obviously the answer in their mind is that Goans are selling the land. So how would you answer that? And the second question together with that is that, you all are protesting everything. You all meaning, this point of view. You all protest everything. You all protest against hotels. You all protest against mega projects or hospitals or convention centers or whatever. How would you respond, putting both these issues from a justice perspective in that sense?
This is a tough one, Frederick. On the one hand, it's tough because on the one hand, we have a social system which is unequal. We have some people who have access to jobs, fairly secure jobs, and we have a set of people who are desperate for. And would it be a problem to blame them if they tap into a market and a lucrative offer, and to make ends meet, to make a living? But we also have, why this is a complex question is also, we have, for instance, data that suggests that 21% of the census 10 years ago, 2011 census, threw up this figure that 21% of homes in Goa are unoccupied. So really, who are we continuously converting land for? We have enormous statistics to tell us that we actually have deep food insecurity. We largely depend
Goa
on food.
as a
Goa
state.
It's huge. It has to bring in food in large quantities from outside. We have the government itself that has created a action plan for climate change, which is pretty scary if you look at the modeling that is done. Low-lying areas with different scenarios. I mean, we perhaps need to imagine a different kind of economy, one that is more equitable, one that is ecologically sound, and to address some of these issues. And I mean, very often some of these responses, empirical responses, are also coming from politics, but it seems, on the other hand, it seems to be business as usual. That is a bit of an unacceptable state for politics not to respond to data, for example, of unemployment, of climate change, sea level rise, a huge stack of unoccupied housing, deficiency in food stocks. This is a question that politics needs to respond.
To add to this point, I think there's also the issue of political power in land use and land control. So while you may have a large tract of land, if you're not connected to political power, it can become almost difficult to impossible to using it. From the 80s or early 90s, maybe, we've been hearing stories of landlords who would be getting threatened that either you sell the land to us meaning politicians who are doubling up as real estates, or we acquire your land under the old acquisition laws. So then in that sense, what do you do? And if you're sitting without political power, someone else sitting there can convert the land, and it goes up in a huge kind of spiraling cost wise. It becomes black gold, virtually brown gold, whatever you want to call it. So, and then also the full tenancy issue. How do you see that also? How does tenancy fit into this debate? Because that is like, in the 60s it was passed with whatever the intentions of one thing, but the way it plays out in the 90s and 2000s is quite different. Would you agree?
Yeah. We've not looked at individual cases of this kind, of landlords being threatened, etc. But the role of politics in the conversion, the commodification, and the alienation of land is absolutely undoubtable. Our studies, practically all of our studies, show this. Terracol, for example, the chapter on Terracol shows this.
Where a full village was being taken over for
over 10 years, where tenancy reforms.
Can you just tell us what Terracol means for those who?
Yes, I mean, what it symbolizes is a story that's happening across Goa. One of the key things we find is that in Terracol, around 2006, the entire village gets converted into a settlement zone because of
Terracol is this village just on the north of Goa, across the Perne River, almost in a small pocket of Maharashtra, and there's a huge project coming up there. I mean, there was
7-star resort with a golf course
covering a large part of the village, and
entire village, except the fort, perhaps. Okay. Yes. So in 2006, we first found that the entire village was converted into a settlement overnight by an applicant who was not even a resident of the village. A particular company applied for it, didn't even appear for the hearing, but the entire village was converted into a settlement. Then, because of the protest, that settlement, the zoning reverted back to the old. So then what we find, this is only the zoning story, is that an ecotourism category is created to facilitate back again the same project. So under the name of ecotourism, you have a huge golf course, and there is by no stretch of imagination the world over does anyone accept that golf courses are in any way eco-friendly in the first place. On the other hand, the other story is even more, insidious. The way in which tenancy, so on the one hand, the state government believes that it has one of the finest tenancy laws that protect tenants. But in Terracol, the story is a huge exercise to get tenants to give up
voluntarily.
Some voluntarily. No,
within quotes, voluntarily within quotes.
Some voluntarily, and others through other means, like a collector passing an order, setting aside the orders, or granting them tenancy decades ago. Unbelievably done with a stroke of a pen. I mean, we have not seen, and this is a constitutional law. This is the tendency that have gone into the Constitution of India, and the manner in which it has been undone is a classic. I mean, the role of the Forest Department, for instance, to suggest that overnight canopy covers can change. I mean, every institution that we have looked at that had a role to play in Terracol has revealed a story where its ethics has completely been reworked with
this is amazing, because at one level it's a very dry, drab story full of facts and figures, but if you don't take note of it, it's going to affect the skyline of Goa, it's going to affect the land use of Goa, it's going to affect the people of Goa, the culture, everything in that sense. So of course, I was not buying into the argument when I said that, you all are protesting everything, but just as devil's advocate, I wanted to see how do we face up to these allegations, because, it doesn't ring true. Even this argument that you're protesting everything doesn't ring true, because people are not going to protest something that is in their interest, in terms of development, infrastructure, it normally means, large concrete-based infrastructural projects, roads, mega projects, those kind of things. It doesn't mean something that would impact the lifestyle of the people in a way that would help them. So I mean, like, which are the projects you studied here, and could you just tell us, like how you mentioned Terracol, what was odd with them? SEZs?
If I just may quickly return to the question you posed earlier, which had to do also with the observation that yes, these Goans are selling their land also. I think I don't want to contest that observation, because that's arguably true. And I think if what we describe in the Great Goa Land Grab was simply a steamroller that rolled over everybody equally, then of course this would be undone quite quickly, because if it was so visibly unjust to everybody, it wouldn't work. No, so it's clear that these things also work by incorporating select interest in this project. But what I would want to say is that I think reducing what we see or what we describe to just a series of individual choices is a very neat kind of trick that can be played by people in power, absolving themselves for the responsibilities of the political economy of the state. No. And I think that's a very common claim in neoliberal contexts, that whatever happens is the outcome of so many individuals making rational decisions. But of course, there's a context in which decisions are made, and that is shaped by politics and economics, which you cannot ignore.
Absolutely.
The second component was this claim about people simply protesting everything. And this is a discourse that we hear both at the state level, but certainly also, if one thinks at the higher levels of politics, that these kinds of protests are damaging India's GDP by so and so many percentage points per year, and that people are getting in the way of development. I think that's a very dismissive attitude towards what is often very reasonable arguments about social justice, about participation, about citizenship, about the right to have a stake. And we don't need to go back many years to show that there are different ways of dealing with people's movements. Other governments in this country have incorporated them into national advisory committees, where they were part of the policy deliberation process, which came up with very innovative programs for rights-based development across a range of sectors: education, food, work, you name it, basically. So there are alternative ways of thinking about people's movements rather than simply dismissing them as getting in the way of what the government of the day would like to see done.
So I want to reiterate emphatically what Kenneth says, which is that politics and policy making it creates the frontier for what is possible. It creates the structures within which we operate. Then is it right to say individuals are making these choices? One, for example, creates a loophole that allows you to do spot zoning changes. You create a master regional plan, and then you say individuals can come and make changes as they want. Or we can create a kind of investment enclave kind of policy that overrides all other policies. Politics is creating loopholes here. Politics is creating new frontiers and not addressing seriously, systematically or systemically the problems of ordinary people.
You're a student of political science, right?
I am a student of development studies.
Okay, initially political science.
Partially, actually. Mostly student of development.
Yeah. I see. At Goa University?
And Goa University in economics. And then international relations, international studies, actually.
Okay.
And development studies, yeah.
Very interesting. We were talking about Terracol. Tell us a little bit about SEZs, just to throw the issue in context. What was so outrageous about it? We are forgetting the facts.
One of the things that steps out, and it takes off on what Kenneth says, when we look at the chronology of whom the SEZs were allocated to, we find that they had made applications for land before the SEZ policy comes around. The SEZ policy comes around as a hindsight, a second thought, in order to accommodate these and give them sweeping, do as you like kind of policies. Now, obviously, is this really about people's development? Is this about the development of ordinary Goans? Or is this development or policies created for select parties? I'm inclined to believe it is for select parties, and so did others, and this was convinced even the court. You simply take the chronology, and that itself is revelatory of what is really happening here. Many projects are sold to Goa as we're going to bring in jobs, etc., but Goa has one of the highest unemployment rates in India.
And then coal, an issue which is still hot now.
I think.
Yeah, if I can just quickly add on to the SEZ discussion. To me, this seems like yesterday that we were discussing SEZs. But if there are people watching this born after the year 2000, they may have no living recollection of what this was all about, which suddenly makes me feel quite old. But this was a policy, a national level policy that came into effect in 2005 with broad-based political support. And I suppose that policymakers had thought that this would be a relatively uncontroversial policy to implement. The idea was to create enclaves,
special economic zones,
which would be regulated in a different way than the rest of the economy, with weaker labor rights, fewer taxes, and so on and so forth. But it turned out to be extremely controversial across the country, and they very quickly became very unpopular. First among people who were dispossessed to make way for them, then later also among policymakers and investors because there was too much trouble associated with them. There were also sites of often spectacular violence. There has been some huge confrontations on this particular issue. So it kind of went off the radar around 2008, 2009.
In Goa, in India?
In India as a whole. I mean, there's still quite a large number of operational zones, which operate at rarely at full capacity. Yeah? So they became politically controversial at the same time as there was increasing evidence coming out that they didn't actually deliver what people thought they would deliver, namely jobs, that they didn't deliver. So when we started to think about the contents of the book, we thought, well, should we include this story? It's a story of the past, in a sense. They are unlikely to come back in the old form. But then, in a sense, by chance, we came across, or I came across an online site for something called the Global Alliance of Special Economic Zones, which is precisely that, an alliance of 7,000 different free zones located in close to 150 different countries. It's quite new. It was formed in 2022. And it wants to promote these zones, not to create jobs or growth, which was the old idea, but to promote the ideals of sustainable development. So here we have a brand new invention of special economic zones to serve a purpose, ostensibly, that is very popular today, which is sustainability. So in light of this, sort of the very real idea that these zones might be making a comeback, I think we included these chapters on special economic zones because they chronicle the contestations, also the dispossession and the frustration, but also the successful people's movements against it. And we also write a little bit about comparatively with West Bengal.
And to go back to coal, because coal is still a hot issue in Goa, how do you see that?
I suppose none of us have worked directly with coal. There is one chapter in there that I have been part of, co-authored with other people who are not part of the book, you might say,
Okay.
but who are experts on coal. And we all know that much of India's energy comes from coal. The majority of electrical energy comes from burning coal. Much of this is excavated and extracted from within India itself. There's a very nice book called Coal Nation by a Bengali social scientist, which details how post-colonial India has, in a sense, been developed through coal. But there's also a new coal economy, or a new coal infrastructure, as we call it, that it comes in addition to the old coal infrastructure that's centered on the northern and eastern Indian states, where coal is found in large quantities. We now have an increasingly number of private actors who are importing coal from afar.
Like Australia?
Like Australia. It's also been from Indonesia, from South Africa, a little bit up and down depending on export regulations in countries of origin, and who then sail this coal into often or sometimes privately owned harbors, or alternatively privately owned berths within a public sector harbor,
I see.
as might be the case in Goa. And then where this coal is then converted to electrical energy, also in privately owned thermal power plants. So at the same time as there's much talk of a transition to green energy, we have this continuous reliance on coal. And that, of course, has to do with India's energy requirements continuing to grow. So that even though you try to build up sustainable alternatives, that
It's never enough.
it's never enough. It becomes an addition to the coal base. So paradoxically, you can have a high increase in renewables, but also a steady increase in coal, because overall consumption continues to increase. So what we write about in this book is, of course, as most people will be aware of, the plans for MPT to become a coal hub for imports, but also the infrastructure that's needed to transport this coal through Goa into Karnataka. And one thing that we are interested in is, this becomes a little bit technical because there are different kinds of coal. Some coal is used in thermal power plants to generate electricity. Other kinds of coal is used for steel production, so-called coking coal. And of course, there's a large amount of steel production in Karnataka, just across the Western Ghats. But there may also be more plans to build thermal power plants. That's not something we know for sure. But if that is the case, there will be potentially an increased pressure to import both kinds of coal into Goa in larger quantities.
What's the response to this work being like?
Well, it's extremely topical,
Yeah.
for sure. So we've had a couple of readings, and interestingly, I've found that the topic of land has entered into university levels or college level teaching as well. Questions of land in Goa are topics that students are dealing with, and there have been a number of teachers who have asked for this book to use it in the curriculum of the book to supplement various other writings, of course, on land, because it is so topical. It almost touches many Goans very deeply.
And it's very contemporary also in that sense. See, normally it's safe in academia, or for whatever reason, maybe just a time lag, that we take up issues which are long since gone. This is something which touches our today and our tomorrow probably. What are the other specific cases that come out in this book that you zero in on? I wanted to also raise this other issue. See, as far as the average Goan in the coast is concerned, especially on the coastline, this issue of large housing colonies and like say villages, Asagam, which was a ghost village, has been taken over by a large set of new real estate ventures in that sense, all over the place. So it means destroying the green cover and all. How does that fit into this story?
Yeah.
Is it connected? Is it not connected? Is it a different kind of trajectory altogether?
It is certainly connected with the emergence of a strong real estate market. And there are a few statistics that we mentioned over here, which are taken from the censuses themselves, that have tracked the number of unoccupied houses, for instance, in Goa from 1991 onwards. And we have tracked that. And it's quite a large figure that in 2011, we're looking at almost 22% of housing stock being unoccupied. This was even signaled to the Town and Country Planning Department by the Census Department. We have seen presentations by them. This was even recognized in the draft regional plan of 2021. This has been written about the problem of second homes and speculative investments that are artificially inflating the price of land, and that it ought to be regulated. We even have comments made by the previous chief town planner warning us about this scenario, but there has been no policy response to it, which signals to us the close relationship that political actors have with this market, or sometimes the two of them coalesce so very well. We are often sold the idea that there is a housing shortage actually, and that we need to build more. There's also a rebuttal to this that I have heard from town planners and architects who have looked at the settlement fence, the amount of settlement land that has already been converted, says that itself is enough to accommodate fresh housing stock, given the concession that we already have 21%. And I'm talking this figure, 22% is 10 years ago. If the recent census, the latest census happens, I'm sure this figure is going to be even more. The other thing that we find is most of these houses are in urban areas. It's not a rural phenomena really, it is mostly in urban areas. And this is something that we really need to, I think, need to stand
The
up.
unoccupied houses?
Yeah. I mean, it's telling us that, so it questions this myth. What are we converting land for? And we're encroaching on most, and if you look at where land conversion is done, it's usually orchard zones and agricultural zones. These are soils that have been created for millennia, and you just concretize this. It's the loss of fertility and all is incalculable, the loss when we already have existing settlement fence that can accommodate.
And there's another thing, the real estate speculation has pushed up prices so much that any average person working and living honestly in Goa would probably not be able to afford a house in Goa.
I can't afford a house.
In that sense. So that's one thing. Of course, the other thing, that's an observation, but the elephant in the room really is also the political connection with this whole sector. Any thoughts on that? So while we at one level we are fighting political battles based on parties, even based on communal lines and all these kind of things. At another level, they're all the same because they many, not all, have come from the real estate sector, right from the state level to the panchayat levels. And, there are all kinds of, and if you talk to people at the village level, they are aware of these things, not that they are not aware. Maybe it's hard for journalists to put their finger on it, or it's hard for academicians to get the breadth of the story all together in one place.
Yeah.
It's a big challenge. But all kinds of things are going on in the village. Like one side racket is you find out who's not in a certain house, and the land gets shifted to that home and to someone else's name and things like that. And fake sale deeds which have come out, dealing with the Home Secretary of Britain as Britain's family and all that kind of thing. So how do you see the political nexus with land speculation?
One of the things that emerges from some of the work, and this is some work that we are developing with other academics. We, for example, see this phenomena of political defections in Goa, which ordinary Goans are completely shocked, baffled by. That even making oaths before deities and gods,
multiple deities of all the religions,
all multiple religions have not even prevented politicians from flow crossing or party hopping or what we call political nomadism happening. One thing that emerges, which ties up to land, is that the incentive, it seems, is a land-related portfolio. Is the incentive for politicians to hop parties and to reward them. It becomes the cement that keeps a party hopper to
fixed in one place.
For some period of time, perhaps. If you look, for example, who heads PDAs, they're all political actors. Who is given the town and country planning?
They are political actors with the highest nuisance value, in a sense.
But in order to reward them and keep them satiated, land-related portfolios are the key. It seems to be the glue that is that keeps this. This is only the story of defection, but I want to just stretch this a little further to remember the provocative sort of hypothesis that Professor Peter mentioned in one of our book presentation discussions, where he said that the market in land has emerged over the last few years so strongly that it has reconfigured so many institutions and ethics itself in Goa. So what we are seeing and it goes back to what he used to teach us as students, that to understand political behavior in Goa, we need to perhaps look at the emergence of the political economy of land. He says, for instance, the institutions that, like politics, should be an institution that needs to tell the market its limits. It has completely been reworked. Personal ethics have been reworked. Villages have fallen apart.
I see.
Families have fallen apart because the ethics have completely been reworked. And as Professor Peter suggested the other day, we also have the emergence of new justificatory rationales, to justify. And this is, it's so provocative and worth
lot of food for thought. But
extremely.
Since the clock is running out, any last thoughts?
I wanted just to if I can briefly add on to what Solano said, and that will be more of a general comment. I think that when we think about these things that we call politics or the state, and a thing we call the market, and a thing we call society, we kind of think that they should be separate and working according to their different logics. Politicians do one thing, the market does another, society does a third thing. But if we begin to trace these connections, I think these categories, they break down, because we see what you might call political relations. We can also just call them sometimes family relations that crisscross influence in state and bureaucracy, with power in the market, with some kind of social dominance also to get things to happen, land to change hands in concrete settings. So I think it's better for our thinking if we don't stick so strongly to these categories of a separate market and a separate state, but think about all these connections that tie them together, because then we begin to see how power operates all across these domains. I think that's an important way of thinking, also looking ahead.
Of course, very interesting. Whatever you all have said today, whatever you all have written, I'm sure it will trigger off a process of helping us understand this crucial issue of land. Thanks so much, Professor Nielsen. Thanks so much, Professor Solano. And looking forward to much more work from both of you all. And of course, Heather Plummeridge Bedi, who is not here at the moment. I think it's very important these serious issues which touch people's lives also get into academia, also get discussed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.